Hey everyone, welcome back to the Long View. I'm Julian Zelizer, and this is Office Hours. And nice to see everyone up and ready to go and sign up. And of course, for those of you who are new, this is my weekly session where I take some of your questions and comments about the news, about all things history. Happy to discuss whatever's on your mind. Tomorrow, my post will come out. Andrea, that's a good question, and I can start with that in 10 seconds. War Powers Act is always something I'm interested in. So, some of you liked the post I put up about Bob Weir. Obviously, a sad moment, but it was an occasion to write about both the music and the culture and what the band, for the many decades they played, really represented, and a different way to think of Americana, and the definition of culture, which really came through with the band and the multiple influences that you can hear, often associated with hippie culture and San Francisco. In fact, it's just much more diverse. And he himself was someone who brought traditional country music to the table in this mix. So I'm glad that all of you enjoyed it. Tomorrow, again, my newsletter will drop, talking about events in Minneapolis, and some thoughts on how the administration has responded to the tragedy that unfolded in that city. And again, soon I'll get my foreign policy article weekly column will be starting again. Anyway, I'll start with Andrea's question on the Senate passage of the War Powers Resolution. Some of you are probably familiar. This is drawing on the War Powers Act of 1973, which I've discussed before here and I've written a lot about. This was a measure in 1973 that was a response to President Richard Nixon, and really also a response to presidents who came before him. A lot of unrest at that time about Lyndon Johnson as well, and the way in which the war in Vietnam had unfolded. But it was very specific to the way Nixon was aggressively wielding executive power, and that included in Southeast Asia. I'll keep jotting down the notes. In Southeast Asia, of course, one of the biggest flare ups revolved around Cambodia in 1970, where leaks revealed that first there were secret bombings being conducted there, and then that Nixon went on TV in late April of 1970 and had announced that troops would be sent in there. This led to protests, most famously in Kent State University in Ohio, where the Ohio National Guard that had been called in by the governor shoots and kills 4 young students who were there to protest. This is one example among many of how this had become such a big political issue. So in 1973, Congress passes the War Powers Resolution, which has many provisions, but including time schedules as to when presidents had to notify Congress about sending troops short of declaring war, and then various measures that allowed Congress then, under certain conditions, to respond, withdraw funds, and more. It certainly has not been seen by many people as the greatest success in the world. Presidents have continued to expand the use of the military. Congress, for many reasons, has been reluctant since 73 to enact it. There are scholars who argue that doesn't mean it's been totally ineffective. Until recently, generally, presidents have still asked for resolutions of support from Congress before using force, much short of a declaration of war, but still something. What we saw in Venezuela is much more in the line of a handful of actions where presidents have simply unilaterally decided to take action. The Senate passage of the resolution a few days ago, it's symbolic. It's not going to get anywhere. But I think it's notable. I mean, I think sometimes we make a mistake in our political system of looking for the all and ignoring some kind of elements of pushback as nothing. This, to me, was significant simply in that Senate Republicans, some of them finally said something rather than nothing about a rather dramatic use of power that has just taken place. But again, it is very limited, and I think there is a reckoning that has happened about under President Trump about how much power is vested in the executive branch and how much we depend on presidents with good character and good judgment to avoid using that power all altogether. Yes, just Dave. I mean that Kent State killing in 1970 was certainly one of the most traumatic moments, and this is relevant to the war powers conversation. But as Jonathan Alter and I did in the last then and now, it's very relevant to what happened in Minneapolis with ICE. This became a killing that really captured the nation's imagination in the worst ways, not simply about the tragedy itself and the person who was killed, but about what it meant for where the federal government was, how the federal government was deploying its power, and much, much more. I can't remember who asked, and forgive me, I think it was Michael saying that it feels like a lot of the Watergate reforms are being undone. I would kind of add a caveat in that they're not all being undone now. These have been undone over the years. And before I get to that, let me say it's important to remember many of them had effect and they were not insignificant at all. I think there's often a mistake that is made that when reforms either weaken over decades or are dismantled, that they never were relevant to begin with. That's not true. The Watergate campaign finance reforms of 1974 were very significant. We still have much stronger disclosure laws today than we did before 1974. We have contribution limits, which have even though now there are ways to circumvent it, for many decades limited how much big money could come into the system easily. The public finance system for campaigns in presidential races, it was a voluntary system, but it was used until Obama and Bush and really did limit private money in presidential elections. I think the War Powers Act resolution, for all its problems, also did still maintain that obligation or at least incentive for presidents to go to Congress and justify what they were doing and ask for support. The ethics reforms are on the books, and people who work in Washington, not in the White House, but who work in other parts of Washington for a long time, have lived knowing that these rules were important in terms of disclosing their income and not accepting certain types of gifts. And I can go through a long list. The FISA court was extraordinarily important to limiting federal surveillance of citizens. So now, they've been dismantled, some have been weakened, but I do think, Michael, you were right in that, like with so many other things, we are seeing a dramatic escalation of the reversals. And that's certainly true with war power. I think that's why the Venezuela events are so significant. I think you're certainly seeing it with ethics and corruption, where the lines that separate the Trump family business from the Trump White House are impossible to see if they exist at all. And that whole era of reform in the 1970s, I think, is coming to an end. And again, my take is not that means it was insignificant, just the opposite. It means really what we're going to need is another era of political reform at some point. And this probably isn't the point because I think for many, the focus is on rebalancing power and changing the leadership. But we are going to need to have an era like the 70s or the progressive era, which is the other best example, the 1900 to 1910s period, where we take institutional reform seriously, where we look at what Common Cause at its founding called really the rules of the game, the process issues that are underlying so many threats that we have to the democracy. If, for example, Congress does not take the next next opportunity, which they missed last time, to deal with the Insurrection Act, for instance, you will always have the potential for a president to exercise the kind of federal power in cities that we are seeing take place right now. So we do need that era of reform as well. Is it a point of no return? I'm sure in this conversation, people here in the office hours have very different points of view. There are some who feel that way. They feel a kind of despondency as we hit the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, that the balance can no longer be achieved at all, that we're in an era of executive power so great in scale and scope that it's impossible to reverse. I see it a little differently. I do believe the potential for reform is always there. I don't think it's healthy for the body politic to lose that hope. But most important, I look to concrete periods where we've been able to achieve reforms, and some of the balance, and the 70s for me is certainly one. And we need to remember that. Um, that era of Nixon was also, by many, felt to be a hugely risky moment for the country, and we will see where that goes. Someone else, I was just scrolling through, asked about the kind of situation that has been created by ICE agents in cities, the notion that it almost inevitability about what was going to happen. And I think there's many critics who feel that way. This was actually one of the lessons of Kent State, to be honest. I mean, one of the lessons was you can't create these fraught environments where you put, in that case, National Guard, but also that would include other kinds of federalized troops into situations, in that case, student protests, in the case we are today, in cities where there's a lot of unhappiness and protest about what ICE is doing, and not expect this to happen. And in this case, we are dealing with ICE forces. We need to remember who are not trained at best for dealing with situations like this, as police are. And they are also often just recruited, as we have seen, and are not necessarily the most trained people in the world. There's a really interesting interview with the chief of police from Minneapolis on the Daily today, who's been working on reforming the forces, and really rebuilding the forces since George Floyd and the protests that followed. And at least in the interview, seems pretty disillusioned. And often the police are shouldering the blame for situations created by ICE. They're often put, literally, officers in the middle of very tense situations between protesters and ICE agents. But he makes the point that many of the ICE agents are simply not trained, as you can see in that video, to deal with these situations. And this is dangerous. So I think the point raised earlier in the comments is absolutely true. That's why often there's a reluctance of presidents to have federal troops, certainly in cities, but almost anywhere, unless it's absolutely necessary and there's total cooperation with the governor and mayor. Otherwise, you create the conditions for potential lethal violence. Some would argue that is, in fact, part of the point. The point is to create crises. The point is to create tense situations. The point is to create justifications for sending further troops, which is, in fact, at least from the news and the statements by Secretary Noem, exactly what is now happening in Minneapolis. That said, and we've talked about this when we talked about the No Kings protests, there were large scale protests in many cities across the country. I think the notion this is all going on, people are not paying attention, people are not happy with this. is very clear by the streets from the scenes in New York, for example. There was a massive demonstration this weekend. And so I do think it taps not just into a human emotion, obviously, of watching someone get killed, but it also taps into a very powerful current and historical current in the United States, individualism, which today is often kind of associated with the right and conservatism, but in fact has much broader appeal. And it goes right back to the Declaration. It goes right back to the founding. So we will see. But obviously, what happened in Minneapolis, just terrible, terrible situation and a tragic loss of life. And it's creating, I think, bigger tensions than are being noticed between the local police and the federal police. So that's where we are. Just Dave, we are going to need election monitors during the midterms. Well, this is a storyline and a problem that we've been talking about for a while, and many who are concerned about the integrity of the midterms and raising that concern is not some hysterical, thought, for example, or warning. We have obviously lived through January 6th as a moment where there was a direct challenge to the legitimacy and integrity of the elections. We've now been going since the 2010s, seeing court decisions steadily erode the voting rights legislation that was put onto the books by the Democratic Congress and Lyndon Johnson in 1965. And in some states, we're seeing the imposition, red states, of voting restrictions, different than the Jim Crow era, but still very significant in making voting hard. And we have a president who openly talks and raises questions about whether he will adhere to election results. So I think these warnings are much needed and very important. And the good news is the elections this year much smaller. The off-year elections went well; they went smoothly generally. This will be a much bigger test. I think the redistricting efforts were the first effort by Republicans to change the rules of the game so that the game was more favorable, as polling is not. I think you saw a response by Democrats in California under Governor Newsom, where hardball was the only response in his mind, and it worked. And right now, many people are skeptical whether all the redistricting will really add up to much. And some even think, given the low approval ratings of the president right now and the GOP, that the redistricting might actually work against the Republicans in some of those places in Texas where we're seeing that Latino vote, for example. The uptick in 2024 might not really be what we're seeing in 2026, which was the whole premise of the Republican plan. So we will see. But yes, I think I don't know how you will and how people will monitor the election, but vigilance between now and November of 2026. We are in election year. Is this year as important as a focus on party organization, as a focus on different kinds of issues and candidate recruitment? And it's an all hands on deck situation, I think, if you are a Democrat, to make sure not only that Democrats do everything necessary to win, but that Democrats do everything necessary to protect the integrity of the election. There is yet another Supreme Court case coming, probably too late to affect the midterms, but would be another big blow to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and that historic legislation, which I really spend a lot of time teaching about, that tried to rectify what happened after Reconstruction, when a really heroic and effective effort to start building a strong and autonomous Black community was undercut by political elements who very much opposed it, particularly in the Deep South. Just Dave, I think certainly many Democrats feel that way. I think you're right to be skeptical, and I don't offer the comment as assurances. I think it's just a possibility. I do think historically redistricting isn't always as easy to predict as we might think. It is easier today because it's so micromanaged, but voters still have the potential to kind of move parts of the electorate in very different ways. Let me take my normal break now just to thank all of the subscribers who have joined me and who will watch this later and who are just part of this Longview community, which it feels just incredibly robust and interesting. I really enjoy getting all your comments and thoughts, and it feels like a community has formed. And thank you, paid subscribers. I know some of you can and some of you cannot be paid subscribers, but those of you who can, you allow this and have allowed this to exist and to grow, and your support means everything. So if some of you might consider becoming paid subscribers who are not, I would greatly appreciate it, and it would help me build an even better platform over the coming years. Okay, back to questions. Someone asked much earlier, so I'm sorry, I forgot who it was, and my handwriting is very messy. But on Venezuela, there is a question. I mean, there's two questions. One, some ask about the comparison to Panama in 1989. That was one question. I think it's complicated. I think there have been good notes about differences between Panama in 1989 and what happened in Venezuela. Panama, there were already troops there, so it was very different. The Panamanian government had actually declared a war on the United States before Operation Just Cause, and also a Marine was killed. So, really different situation than here, where the justification is certainly, regardless of how bad Maduro is, not as clear, where the legitimacy of what the United States did certainly it has been challenged many times. Many people say it is a blatant violation of international law. And it's not even clear what the plan is in terms of what's going to come next, as the regime itself was, for now, left in place. One area I've written about, I wrote about on the Longview, where there is something interesting. Back in Panama in 1989, when President George H.W. Bush took that action, there were a small group, but a group of Democrats, including Charlie Rangel of New York, Don Edwards of California, who were very much opposed to what the administration was doing. And the warnings were really interesting to look back at the archives and read. They ranged from, why is the United States expending resources on this as opposed to expending those resources on American citizens here in the United States? At a time, many were struggling and didn't understand why Panama was essential. And secondly, the warnings were also about, if you grant presidents the ability to do this, in that case, George H.W. Bush, you create a precedent, a foundation for much kind of bolder acts and other acts of war in the future. And I think we're seeing that play out. This is the lesson, that when you create those conditions, there's a high chance you will have a president exploit those conditions. And that is what we are seeing in ways you couldn't even imagine years earlier. Don, who wrote in, when I wrote that piece, he corrected, I had put Len Edwards instead of Don Edwards at one point, which is kind of interesting. So Len was his son, who's a judge. but he was also an activist in Freedom Summer. Don Edwards is a fascinating, I know this is a tangent, Don, but I'll go into it. He was a fascinating Democrat from California who traveled to Mississippi during Freedom Summer in 64, who visited civil rights activists and constantly surveyed what was going on and created pressure in Washington for not just legislation, but Edwards was one of the Democrats who called on President Johnson to use and provide federal protection for civil rights activists and Black Mississippians who were part of Freedom Summer. And his son Lee, who I had switched the name, he was a student there. So there's remarkable scenes. I'm writing a book about this, so it is on my mind, where Congressman Edwards visits his son as it's happening and as he's speaking. Interestingly, Johnson really didn't want to send federal protection. Many civil rights activists at the time there thought that's justified. There you have a total breakdown of law and order, refusal of the state in Mississippi to protect individual citizens. But that reluctance, again, and I've talked about this, was very deep. And President Trump is very different in how liberally he thinks of using this without any of the kind of justification that actually existed back in the summer of 1964 when police were harassing, intimidating, and threatening Black and white civil rights activists. So I forgot to mention at the end of this week, we'll have Then and Now. I also have Karen Greenberg, who is a national security expert, talking about a piece that she wrote about torture and the kind of reemergence of torture at pretty high levels, as well as what she calls President Trump's war on women within Washington. And also Joanne Mort, who is a very, very good journalist who writes about the Middle East, some of the best coverage I've seen, has a new book of poetry, Precise Chaos, that is out and little different, but it has deep connections to what she's written about. I'll be talking to her on Friday as well. And the last thing I want to say before I sign off, if you have suggestions of authors who you come across, or even journalists who've written opinion pieces that you think might be interesting, particularly those who are active on Substack, please feel free to send me a note. And sometimes I can reach them, sometimes I can't, but that's really helpful for me sometimes for learning of voices who I am not as aware of, but who might be good for the long view. So thanks again to everyone. I'm looking forward to an interesting week. And again, my newsletter will be out tomorrow morning. Thanks, everyone. Be safe and have a nice day.